my name is Saraphina Croft. For 32 years, that name has felt less like an identity and more like a placeholder, a quiet signature on a life that belonged to everyone but me. I am a painter, or at least I was. My father, Arthur, was a painter, and for the first 8 years of my life, the scent of turpentine and linseed oil was the smell of home. After he died and my mother remarried, the smell became lemon-scented cleaner and the faint, cloying aroma of my half-sister's expensive perfume. I was the only child from my mother's first marriage, a living relic of a life she seemed eager to forget. I used to believe that if I made myself small enough, quiet enough, indispensable enough, I might one day earn a space in their family portrait. But as I stood in the heart of the Adirondack Mountains, the crisp September air a cold shock against my skin, I finally understood. Some spaces are not meant for you, no matter how perfectly you learn to fold yourself to fit. The engine of the family's luxury SUV had faded into the silence of the pines, leaving behind only the scent of exhaust and betrayal. On a flat, moss-covered rock near the edge of the woods, a single sheet of paper was weighed down by a small, polished rose quartz crystal. The ink from a fine-tipped pen was a deep, mocking blue. Time for a little spiritual cleanse, Saraphina. Let's see if you can manifest your way out of this. Below it, Isla's crystal, the one she claimed held the frequency of unconditional love, gleamed faintly in the twilight. She knew. They all knew. They left me. If you have ever had to choose between the family you were given and the person you were meant to be, then perhaps you will understand the stillness that fell over me. It wasn't shock. It was a quiet, profound recognition. I'm Saraphina Croft, 32, a painter who for the last decade has been an unpaid personal assistant, a ghost haunting the hallways of a beautiful home in Oak Haven, Pennsylvania. And as the last light bled from the sky, something deep in my gut, something I thought had died long ago, finally settled. You cannot be loved by people who do not see you. And you cannot be abandoned by people you were never truly with. For days earlier, our family had embarked on what my stepfather, Gregory, called their annual restorative retreat. For me, it was 3 days of meticulously organized erasure. I was the one who cross-referenced the packing lists, who remembered Gregory's decaf espresso pods, and my mother Eleanor's specific brand of chamomile tea. I was the one who packed Isla's 20-step skincare routine into labeled pouches, and still, I ended up in the third row of the SUV, my knees pressed against a cooler that smelled of stale sandwiches. Smile, Saraphina, Isla had murmured, her phone already angled for a candid shot for her Instagram story. She was a wellness influencer, her brand built on a curated aesthetic of serenity and high-end mindfulness. Family time is sacred energy. I had offered a thin, practiced smile. Any authentic response would be twisted into content. Last year, a video of me quietly washing dishes after a family dinner, captioned "The Beauty of Selfless Service," garnered her thousands of likes and a sponsorship from an organic soap company. I was her prop for humility, the silent, somber background that made her manufactured light seem brighter. I was nothing special in their world, just the quiet girl who cleared the plates, walked the dog, and disappeared without a fuss. When they laughed about shared memories of lavish vacations and childhood antics, I would sit in silence, an archivist of a history I was not a part of. I had arrived in their lives as a package deal with my mother, Eleanor, when she married Gregory, a man who managed wealth with the same cool, detached precision he managed his family. I had moved back into their home 5 years ago, after a small gallery that showed my work went bankrupt and my apartment lease ended. I'd told myself it was temporary. They treated it as my final destination. I became the dog walker, the grocery shopper, the one who made life seamless, especially for Isla, whose brand as a spiritual guide demanded a life free of mundane inconveniences. This year's trip was Gregory's idea. The mountain air will clear out the negative attachments, he declared over a dinner of grilled salmon, slicing into the fish with the meticulous care of a surgeon. No one asked if I wanted to go. My presence was assumed, like the luggage rack on the car. The first 3 days were a familiar ballet of subtle exclusion. Isla hogged the best views for her golden hour photo shoots. Gregory drove with a tense, forward-leaning posture as if escaping something. My mother, Eleanor, sat in the passenger seat, her smile as fixed and placid as a doll's, her eyes never once meeting mine in the rearview mirror. On the third night, after a dinner of campfire-grilled vegetables and quinoa, while I was scrubbing the cast-iron skillet by the light of a headlamp, Gregory approached me. "Saraphina, we're out of firewood. There's a good patch of fallen birch about a 15-minute walk down that trail. Think you can handle that?" I looked up, my gaze searching for my mother's. She was staring into the fire, her profile illuminated, unmoving. "Go on, Saraphina," she said, her voice as flat and gray as the evening sky. "We're all a bit tired." I grabbed a canvas tote and a flashlight. There was no point in arguing, no use in asking why someone else couldn't go. No one offered to come with me. As I walked away, I heard Gregory mutter to Isla, "Let's see if she can do at least one thing without a fuss." The words didn't sting anymore. They were just part of the ambient noise of my life. The trail was dark, the air thick with the smell of damp earth and pine. I remember the rhythmic crunch of leaves under my boots, the beam of my flashlight dancing over fallen logs and intricate spiderwebs. A strange sense of peace settled over me, a quiet solitude that felt more honest than the performative togetherness of the campsite. The trees felt like silent witnesses. When I returned, the clearing was empty. The fire was out, the embers carefully doused. The camp chairs, the tents, even the cooler I had been leaning against in the car all gone. The ground was unnervingly smooth, disturbed only by the faint, parallel tracks of the SUV's tires heading back toward the main road. And then I saw it. The note. The crystal. Isla's star-shaped bracelet from Story 1 was now a rose quartz, the symbol of love, left on the rock like a final, cruel joke. I sank to the ground, the bag of firewood still slung over my shoulder. The sun had fully set, and the cold was no longer just in the air, it was crawling up my spine, a deep, internal chill. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just sat there, remembering all the other, smaller abandonments. Being forgotten at school pickup in the 3rd grade. My mother telling me my father's paintings were too morose to hang in the new house, packing them away into a dusty attic. Isla accidentally spilling an entire bottle of kombucha on my most detailed charcoal drawing, filming my reaction for a post she titled, "Learning to Let Go of Earthly Attachments." I stayed there until the darkness was absolute, the stars sharp and merciless in the black sky. The flashlight beam grew weak, then died. My jaw ached from shivering. I curled into a tight ball, hugging my knees, my face buried in the rough fabric of my jacket. "I'm not going back," I whispered, the words swallowed by the vast, indifferent wilderness. The only reply was the sighing of the wind through the pines. "I am not someone you can just throw away." I didn't know it then, but that wasn't an end. It was a beginning. I woke to a sky the color of slate, a fine mist clinging to my clothes and hair. The ground was hard and cold, and every muscle in my body protested as I pushed myself to a standing position. My jacket was stiff with pine sap, and the faint, smoky scent on my sleeves was the only proof that the campsite, the family, had been real at all. There was no laughter, no hum of a generator, just the lonely call of a distant bird and the rustle of the wind, which seemed to whisper a single word, alone. Lightheaded with hunger, my ankle throbbing from a slight twist the night before, I started walking. There was no point in waiting. You don't wait for people who have already decided you aren't worth returning for. The trail sloped downhill, a narrow ribbon of dirt winding through ancient hemlocks and granite boulders. I had no map, no destination, only the primal instinct that I could not stay still. By midday, the relentless forest gave way to a stretch of cracked asphalt, a forgotten county road bisecting the wilderness. There were no signs, no mile markers. I sat on my canvas bag at the edge of the road, the silence broken only by the buzz of insects. After what felt like an eternity, an old, faded green pickup truck sputtered to a stop beside me. The driver, a man with a kind, weathered face and a silver buzz cut, leaned across the seat. "Name's Jedediah," he said, his voice raspy but gentle. "You look a little lost, miss." I tried to speak, but my voice was a dry crackle. I just nodded. "Need a ride to the nearest town?" Another nod. He didn't press for details. He simply opened the passenger door, and I climbed in, grateful for the warmth of the cab and the soft country music playing on the radio. He drove without a word, treating my silent, disheveled state with a quiet respect that felt more comforting than any question could have. The nearest town was Havenwood, Vermont, a place that seemed to have been overlooked by the relentless march of time. It had a town green, a white-spired church, and a main street lined with brick buildings housing a bakery, a hardware store, and a small, independent bookstore. I used the payphone outside the general store, my fingers trembling as I fed it a handful of quarters I'd found in my jacket pocket. I didn't call my mother or Gregory. They were no longer my emergency contacts. I called the one person my father had always trusted. My Aunt Rowena. I still remembered the number by heart. When she answered, her warm, earthy voice was a balm to my frayed nerves. "Saraphina? Is that you, sweetheart?" My throat closed up. "Rowena," I managed to whisper. "I'm in a town called Havenwood, in Vermont." "Stay right where you are," she said, her tone leaving no room for argument. "You don't belong to them anymore. You belong here." Rowena lived in a small, cedar-shingled house just outside of town, nestled beside a gurgling creek. She picked me up in her clay-dusted Subaru, its engine rattling with a comforting predictability. Her home smelled of wet earth, wood smoke, and brewing tea. It was cluttered and imperfect, with stacks of books on every surface and half-finished pottery on the shelves, but it felt more like a home than Gregory's sterile mansion ever had. She didn't ask what happened. She just wrapped me in a heavy, hand-woven blanket, pressed a warm mug of chamomile tea into my hands, and said, "The guest room bed is made. If the cats try to sleep on your face, just nudge them off. They're used to it." I slept for nearly 2 days, a deep, dreamless sleep that was less about rest and more about escape. When I finally emerged, my body ached, but the frantic, anxious hum that had been my constant companion for years was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness. I heard only the birds, the creek, and the distant, rhythmic thud of Rowena working at her potter's wheel. The next morning, a note was waiting for me on the rustic kitchen table, written on the back of a grocery receipt. It listed a few part-time job openings in town: the bakery, the co-op market, the bookstore. "No high-powered careers here," Rowena had written in her loopy script, "but honest work has a way of healing what talk can't touch." I chose the bookstore, the Story Keeper. It was a quiet, dusty haven with low pay and early hours, but no one there looked at me as if I were an inconvenience. Mrs. Finch, the owner, was a woman with kind, crinkly eyes who always called me by my name. "Saraphina, you have such a gentle touch with the old books," she said one afternoon, watching me carefully mend a torn page. I smiled a real smile, a small, unfamiliar feeling that warmed me from the inside out. I met Owen while he was fixing a loose shelf in the history section. He was a local carpenter, quiet and unassuming, with flecks of sawdust in his dark hair and kind, amber eyes that seemed to notice everything. He didn't say much, just a soft, "Mornin', Saraphina," each day when he came in for his coffee from the small cafe in the back. Not honey or sweetheart, just my name, spoken as if it had weight and meaning. At first, I thought he was just being polite. Then one morning, when I was feeling particularly fragile, he set a thermos on the counter beside me. "Brought you some tea," he mumbled, his gaze fixed on a point just over my shoulder. "Looked like you could use it." I held the warm thermos, my hands trembling slightly. "Why?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He gave a small shrug. "Someone did the same for me once when I was having a hard time. Just passing it on." It wasn't a pickup line. It wasn't pity. It was simple, unadorned kindness. I found myself clutching the thermos as if it were a lifeline, a tangible piece of proof that goodness still existed in the world. That night, for the first time in years, I took out my old sketchbook. The first few pages were filled with faint, unfinished drawings from a lifetime ago. On one page was a half-finished portrait of my father, his eyes gentle, his hand resting on my small shoulder. I had never forgotten how that hand felt. Steady. Present. Real. Sitting by the window in the guest room, the moonlight tracing patterns on the worn wooden floor, I picked up a pencil. I began to draw again. This time, I wasn't trying to impress anyone or prove my worth. I was just trying to remember. I was trying to hold on to the parts of me that mattered. I didn't know where this new path would lead, but as the graphite whispered across the page, I felt a flicker of hope. I was no longer a ghost in someone else's story. I was starting to write my own. And I didn't yet know that the past wasn't just a memory, it was a map, and I was about to find a hidden trail. I found the box on a rain-swept Tuesday, sent to the attic by Rowena to search for an old quilt. The attic was a sanctuary of forgotten things, smelling of cedar and thyme. Tucked behind a stack of National Geographics was a worn cardboard box, sealed with yellowed packing tape. Scrawled across the top in my father's unmistakable architectural script were 2 words, for Saraphina. My breath caught. I ran my fingers over his handwriting, a jolt of connection so sharp it felt like a physical touch. I carried the box downstairs, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. Rowena saw it as she was trimming the wick of a candle. She didn't look surprised, only a quiet sadness in her eyes. "He gave that to me a month before the accident," she said softly. "He told me to give it to you when you were old enough to understand. I guess I was waiting for you to be strong enough." Inside, nestled in tissue paper, were not just letters, but his journals. Dozens of them, bound in worn leather. They were filled with sketches, notes, and raw, beautiful entries about his art, his love for my mother before she changed, and his fierce, protective love for me. But it was the last journal, dated the year he died, that held the truth. "My dearest Saraphina," he had written, his penmanship growing slightly unsteady. "If you are reading this, it means I can no longer protect you myself. But I did what I could. I've set up a small trust for you, the Arthur Croft Legacy Trust. It's not a fortune, but it's a seed. Enough for an education, a start in life, a way to chase your art without fear. It is to be managed by an independent trustee until you turn 25. Your mother knows of it, but she cannot touch the principal. Never let anyone tell you that your dreams are an indulgence. They are your birthright." I sat on the floor of Rowena's living room, the journal open in my lap, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through my chest. The trust. It was real. I was 32. What had happened to it? "He set it up, Saraphina," Rowena said, her voice thick with old anger. "But after he was gone, Eleanor and her new husband petitioned the court. They claimed managing 2 separate estates was too complicated. They had it absorbed into their family's general fund, under Gregory's management. They were named your financial guardians. They were supposed to keep it safe for you." I looked up at her, the pieces clicking into place with sickening clarity. The designer clothes for Isla, the lavish trips I was brought on as a prop, the constant narrative that I was a financial burden they had graciously shouldered. It was all a lie, funded by the very legacy my father had left to protect me. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat with my father's journals, tracing the lines of his sketches, reading his words until the sun came up. He wasn't just a ghost from my past. He was a man who had tried to build me a future. They hadn't just abandoned me in the woods. They had been robbing me, piece by piece, for my entire life. The next morning, I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, hard resolve. I went to the small library in town and spent hours researching. Guardianship laws. Fiduciary duty. Breach of trust. The language was dense and intimidating, but I took meticulous notes. I wasn't just a wounded girl anymore. I was my father's daughter. Before I could even decide on a course of action, the past reached out to me. An email appeared in my inbox from a name I vaguely recognized, Leo Thorne. The subject line was simple: Gregory Thorne's son. "Saraphina," the email began, "I know we don't know each other well. I'm Gregory's son from his first marriage. He kicked me out when I was 18 for irresponsible behavior, which really meant I questioned his business ethics. I saw an article about the Havenwood Bookstore online and saw your name mentioned as a new employee. I have a feeling you might be in the same position I was. I have documents. Records of transfers from a trust with your name on it into Gregory's personal investment accounts. He called it strategic allocation. The law would call it theft. If you want them, they're yours. I printed the email and showed it to Rowena. She read it, her lips tightening into a thin line. The universe has a funny way of balancing the scales, she murmured. What are you going to do? I didn't know. My head was spinning. But as I looked at my hands, stained with ink from the library printer, I felt a new kind of strength. I was no longer just sketching the outlines of my life. I was ready to start filling it in with color. That evening, Owen found me sitting on a bench on the town green, staring into space. He didn't ask what was wrong. He just sat down beside me and handed me a small, smooth stone he'd picked up from the creek bed. For your collection, he said quietly. I took the stone, its coolness a comfort in my palm. It's not just a collection, I whispered. It's a foundation. I didn't know it then, but I was about to be tested. The life I was building was about to withstand its first storm. An email with the subject line, "Family Emergency," arrived the next day. It was from my mother. The email was short, devoid of any warmth or preamble. Each sentence was a carefully constructed tool of manipulation. Isla is in serious trouble. That wellness brand she was promoting turned out to be a scam, and now she's named in a class action lawsuit. Gregory's firm is also under a federal audit. Things are falling apart. We are your family, Saraphina. We need your help. I stared at the screen, a strange calm washing over me. There was no pull of obligation, no flicker of old, misplaced loyalty. The words "we need your help" translated clearly in my mind to "we need you to take the fall, or at least, sign away your rights, so we have one less thing to worry about." I didn't reply. I closed my laptop and went to Rowena's studio. The smell of wet clay and the steady rhythm of her wheel were grounding. I picked up a lump of clay and began to knead it, the physical work a release for the emotional turmoil. Later that week, a formal letter arrived from a law firm in Pennsylvania. It was a settlement offer. In exchange for my signature on a document stating that all financial matters concerning the Arthur Croft Legacy Trust had been handled to my satisfaction, they would wire me a sum of $25,000, a gesture of goodwill. I laughed. A dry, humorless sound. They were trying to buy my silence for a fraction of what they had stolen. That night, I sat down with my father's journals again. In the back pocket of one, I found something I had missed, a folded piece of paper with a name and number. Beatrice Hayes, financial advisor. A friend. Trust her. The next morning, my hand shaking slightly, I made the call. When I explained who I was, there was a long pause on the other end. Saraphina Croft, Beatrice Hayes's voice was crisp and professional, but held a note of surprise. Your father, he was a good man. He was worried something like this might happen. She paused. He set up a second, smaller account for you. A custodial account with a different bank, under a different name, with me as the administrator. He called it his emergency plan. It was never consolidated. Your mother and stepfather don't know it exists. It's been sitting there, collecting interest, for 24 years. I sank into a chair, my legs suddenly weak. Untouched. A piece of my father's foresight, a life raft he had secretly built for me, had survived the storm. The amount wasn't life-changing, just over $50,000, but it felt like a kingdom. It was mine. It was clean. A few days later, the official documents arrived from Beatrice. I held the papers in my hands, proof of a future my father had secured for me. That same afternoon, Owen stopped by Rowena's house. He had a roll of architectural paper under his arm. What's that? I asked, my voice still thick with emotion. He unrolled it on the kitchen table. It was a detailed sketch of the old, dilapidated shed behind Rowena's studio. He had redesigned it, adding a large, north-facing window and a proper work table. Figured a painter needs a proper studio, he said, not quite meeting my eyes. A space to exist. A space to exist. The words echoed in my soul. It was so simple, yet it was everything I had ever wanted. That evening I lay in bed, the moonlight streaming through the window. I wasn't thinking about Isla's lawsuit or Gregory's audit. I was thinking about my father's hidden gift, about Owen's quiet generosity, about the sturdy, unshakable presence of Rowena. I was beginning to understand that family wasn't about blood. It was about who showed up, who stayed, who helped you build a space to exist. I thought the worst of the storm had passed. But I was wrong. The past wasn't just sending letters, it was about to show up on my doorstep. I was in the newly renovated studio, the scent of fresh pine and paint filling the air, when I heard the crunch of tires on the gravel driveway. It wasn't Owen's old truck or Rowena's Subaru. This sound was smooth, expensive, and utterly out of place. I stepped outside, wiping my paint-stained hands on a rag. A sleek, silver sedan was parked by the gate. The woman who emerged from the driver's seat made the air leave my lungs. It was Isla. She was wearing a cream-colored pantsuit, her hair perfectly styled, but there were dark circles under her eyes that no amount of concealer could hide. She walked toward me with a practiced confidence that seemed to falter with each step. Saraphina. She smiled, a brittle, unconvincing expression. You look well. I stood my ground on the porch of the studio. How did you find me? The internet isn't that big a place, she said with a shrug, though her hands were twisting the strap of her designer handbag. A few articles about a new artist in a small Vermont town. It wasn't hard. What do you want, Isla? Her smile vanished. She glanced past me into the studio at the canvases lining the walls. I came to ask for your help. In person. You have 60 seconds. The time limit, the coldness in my voice, clearly unnerved her. She was used to controlling the narrative. Gregory's legal troubles are worse than we thought, she began, her voice low and rushed. The audit it uncovered everything. The trust fund. They're calling it embezzlement. And my lawsuit, I could lose everything. You promoted a fraudulent product to your followers. 18 of them were college students who lost their savings, I said, my voice flat. Her face flushed. I didn't know it was a scam. I was just the face of the brand. A flicker of something, not guilt, but raw fear crossed her face. We need you to sign a document. An affidavit. Just a statement saying you were always cared for, that you consider the matter of the trust resolved. It would make things look better. It might make them go easier on Dad. On me. You want me to lie for you? For Mom, she whispered, her voice cracking. She's not handling this well. She's fragile. I thought of my mother's fragility, the carefully constructed helplessness that had allowed so much cruelty to happen under her roof. I thought of her, sitting in the passenger seat, staring into the fire while her daughter was sent into the dark woods to be abandoned. What did my mother say when you all drove away and left me there? I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. Isla flinched. She had no answer. Leave, I said, the word as solid and unmoving as a stone wall. Leave my home. Her eyes filled with tears, real or performative, I couldn't tell. I knew you'd be angry, but I didn't think you'd be this cruel. This isn't cruelty, Isla, I said, stepping off the porch to stand directly in front of her. It's a boundary. If you have ever been called cruel for simply refusing to be used, for finally drawing a line in the sand, then you know the strength that filled me in that moment. It wasn't born of anger, but of a deep, unshakable self-respect I had fought so hard to find. When the sedan finally pulled away, kicking up a cloud of dust, I didn't feel victorious. I just felt quiet. Owen was at the far end of the garden, pretending to inspect a fence post, giving me my space. You okay? He asked, his voice soft. I nodded, leaning against the doorframe of my studio. Part of me, a very small part, still feels sorry for her, I admitted. But the rest of me is done being the person they thought they could break. That's not being cruel, he said, walking over to stand beside me. That's being whole. That night, I took the settlement offer from the lawyers and, without a moment's hesitation, fed it into Rowena's wood-burning stove. I watched the paper curl and blacken, the words turning to ash. What I didn't expect was that a few days later, I would be sitting across from them, not on my land, but in a place of their choosing. The meeting took place in a sterile, anonymous diner off a highway in upstate New York, a halfway point between my new life and their crumbling one. Rowena drove me, settling into a booth in the back with a book, a silent, steady anchor in the storm. Gregory was already there, his tailored suit looking out of place against the cracked vinyl of the booth. Eleanor sat beside him, looking smaller and older than I remembered. Isla was at the end, her gaze fixed on the condensation of her water glass. "Let's not waste time," Gregory began, his tone all business. "We have a proposal." I placed a single manila folder on the table. "I'm not here to negotiate," I said calmly. Eleanor reached across the table, her hand hovering near mine. "Saraphina, please. Your father, he wouldn't have wanted all this ugliness." "My father," I said, looking her directly in the eye, "wouldn't have wanted his daughter to be abandoned in the woods. He wouldn't have wanted his legacy to be stolen to fund a lifestyle of deceit." A tense silence fell over the table. "This is revenge, then," Gregory said, his voice laced with contempt. "No," I replied, opening the folder. "This is the truth." I slid a copy of Leo's documents across the table, followed by the statements from Beatrice Hayes. "You didn't just absorb my father's trust. You liquidated assets and funneled the money into high-risk ventures that benefited only you." Isla let out a small, choked sob. Eleanor just stared at her hands, her face ashen. I pulled out one last thing from the folder. A crumpled bus ticket. "This is the bus ticket from a town near the Adirondacks to Burlington, Vermont. It cost $22.50. That's what you left me with. That's the value you placed on my life." I stood up, my hands steady. "I don't want your money. I don't want an apology. I just want you to know that I see you. All of you. And I am done." As I walked out of the diner, the rain began to fall, washing the dust from the air. Rowena was waiting by the car, an umbrella already open. "You look like you just set down a very heavy weight," she said, her eyes full of a quiet pride. On the drive back to Havenwood, I felt a sense of release so profound it was almost dizzying. It wasn't the end of their story, but it was the end of my part in it. When we got back to the studio, I walked over to my easel. My father's unfinished portrait was waiting for me. For the first time, my hand didn't shake as I picked up the brush. I was ready to complete the picture. 3 days after the diner, a call came from a number I didn't recognize. "Saraphina Croft? This is Beatrice Hayes. I have something else for you. Something your father left in my safekeeping. He didn't want to put it in writing in the journals, in case they fell into the wrong hands." I flew to Boston the next day. Beatrice's office was in a historic building overlooking the harbor. She was a tall, elegant woman with silver hair and kind, intelligent eyes. She handed me a small, locked wooden box. "He called this his true north," she said. Inside was a set of keys and a deed. A deed to a small seaside cottage in Maine. "He bought it the year you were born," Beatrice explained. "It's held in an independent trust that I oversee. He wanted you to have a place that was just yours. A place to paint. A place to breathe." I stared at the photograph attached to the deed. A small, weathered cottage with blue shutters, perched on a cliff overlooking the ocean. Sea Spray Cottage. I remembered it. Vague, sun-drenched memories of being a little girl, my hands covered in paint, the sound of the ocean a constant lullaby. When I told Rowena, she simply smiled. Your father always did have a plan B. The following week, I drove to Maine. The road to Sea Spray Cottage was a winding coastal highway, the air growing thick with the scent of salt and pine. The cottage was just as I remembered it from the photograph, small and sturdy, waiting patiently. I slid the key into the lock, and the door swung open with a soft creak. The air inside was still, smelling of old wood, sea salt, and something else, something that felt like peace. On the wall of the main room, faint but still visible, was a chalk drawing of a bright orange fox, its tail a flourish of fire. My drawing. From when I was 7. My father had preserved it under a layer of varnish. I sank to my knees on the dusty floor, and this time I finally cried. Not tears of sorrow or anger, but of overwhelming gratitude. I was home. I moved into the cottage permanently. The rhythms of my life became the rhythms of the tides. I woke with the sun, painted in the light-filled studio that overlooked the water, and walked on the beach as the stars came out. Owen came to visit, his quiet presence a perfect counterpoint to the wildness of the sea. He helped me fix the leaky roof and build new bookshelves, our comfortable silence filled with the sounds of hammers and the ocean. One afternoon, a package arrived. No return address. Inside was my old sketchbook, the one Isla had ruined years ago. The damaged pages had been painstakingly repaired. Tucked inside was a single unsigned note. "I'm sorry." I placed the sketchbook on my new shelf. It was a scar, but it was a part of my story. The following month, I used the money from my father's emergency fund to launch the Arthur Croft Legacy Grant, a small fund to provide art supplies and mentorship to young people from difficult family situations. We don't call them victims. We call them artists in residence. Our first gathering was on the lawn of the cottage. A handful of teenagers sat in a circle, sketching the coastline, their faces full of a fierce, fragile hope that I recognized as my own. That evening, as the sun set over the water, casting the sky in shades of rose and gold, I hung the finished portrait of my father in the living room. In the painting, his hand was no longer on my shoulder. It was extended, as if offering me the brush. My story isn't about revenge. It's about reclamation. It's about understanding that a family that requires you to shrink yourself to fit is not a family, but a cage. It's about building your own home, not with bricks and mortar, but with boundaries, truth, and the quiet, unshakable courage to paint your own world into existence. I don't know where you are as you read this. Maybe you're in a place that feels too small, with people who don't see you. If you are, I want you to know this. Your canvas is waiting. The truest, most beautiful parts of you are not the ones that were taken away, but the ones you have yet to create. All you have to do is pick up the brush.